Wild Amanuensis Road bends quietly through Haverhill, New Hampshire, with trees close to the shoulders and winter fields lying back from the pavement. And on the 9th of February 2004, the snow along that road held the soft grey colour of a day that had already given most of its light away. You begin there because every careful investigation begins somewhere small, with a road name, a bend, a time written into a log, and the simple fact that a young woman's car came to rest near the edge of the road while the evening settled around it like paper. By the time anyone understood that this was not just a car left after a minor accident, the scene had already become part of ordinary memory for the people nearby. A sound outside a house, a glance through a window, a passing driver stopping for a moment, and then the blue and red routine of responders arriving in the cold. It is one of the hardest things about old cases, this plainness at the beginning, because the first minutes rarely announce themselves as history, and the people inside them are only doing what people do when a car is off the road on a dark winter evening. Maura Murray was 21 years old then, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, known by her family as bright and athletic, a runner, a daughter, a sister, and someone whose life cannot be reduced to the outline of her disappearance. When you open the file with any real care, you have to let her be a full person first. Not a symbol, not a puzzle piece, and not a shadow placed at the center of a mystery. But Maura, with her own habits and worries and laughter and private thoughts, many of which were never meant to be sorted by strangers, under the lamp of hindsight. Earlier that Monday, before the road in New Hampshire became the place everyone would return to, Maura was still connected to campus life, to emails, to phone calls, to the ordinary movements of a student day that seems clearer in records than it could ever have felt while it was happening. She had left Amherst and driven north in a black Saturn, and investigators would later look back over that departure with patient attention, tracing what could be traced and leaving blank what resisted being known. That is what it was like to investigate the Maura Murray case, in the beginning and for years afterward. Not a rush towards a single answer, but a slow return to the same few facts, the same road, the same missing space between one confirmed sighting and all the silence that came after. You sit with a timeline that looks solid from a distance, and then when you lean closer, you see that it is made of human recollections, dispatch records, phone bills, receipts, searches, weather, and the quiet uncertainty that lives between each minute. The day itself had a shape, as most days do, though nobody knew at the time that it would be studied for decades by detectives, family members, journalists, neighbors, and strangers who wanted to understand. Maura had contacted people at the university, and she had indicated that she would be away for a short time, giving an explanation that later did not match what her family understood to be true. And this became one of those details investigators had to hold without forcing it to say more than it could. A detail like that can feel heavy in an old file, but it is important to handle it gently because young lives are complicated, and stress, privacy, confusion, and ordinary human avoidance can all leave strange marks in records. You can imagine an investigator reading those messages again and again, not with judgment, but with the tired concentration of someone asking whether a sentence points toward danger, toward distress, toward planning, or toward nothing more dramatic than a young woman trying to create space. There were searches for directions, there were calls, there was a withdrawal of money, and there was surveillance footage from earlier in the day, the kind of flat, practical image that investigators learn to study without expecting it to speak. In such footage, a person is both present and unreachable, moving through the last ordinary errands anyone can confirm, and the investigator watching it years later may notice a jacket, a posture, a bag, a glance downward, and still not know what Maura was thinking as the camera preserved only the surface. This is one of the quiet burdens of patient detective work, that records preserve actions better than reasons. And the reasons are often what everyone wants most. A receipt can say that something was bought, a call log can say that a number was dialed, a computer search can say that a direction was looked up, but none of these can fully enter the private weather of a person's mind. So the investigator learns to live beside uncertainty, not as a failure, but as a condition of the work, and the file becomes a room where certain objects are always in the same places. There is the university, there is the road north, there is the black Saturn, there is the evening in Haverhill, And there is the moment when the known world narrows to a vehicle off Route 112 and a young woman who was there and then was gone. At approximately 7:30 that evening, a report came in about a car off the road in Haverhill, near a curve where local people knew the road well and where winter made the edges less forgiving. The roads in that area were snow-covered, and the simple environmental fact matters, because searchers later had to think not only about direction and distance, but also about temperature, footing, visibility, and how quickly a person might move along a rural road in February. A school bus driver who lived nearby stopped and spoke briefly with the young woman near the car, and according to the broad public understanding of the case, she declined help and indicated that assistance had already been called. That exchange has been revisited endlessly, but in the work of investigation it begins as something very modest. A neighborly pause on a winter road, a few words through the dark, and then each person continuing into the next part of the evening. When police arrived, Maura was not at the car, and that absence became the center of everything that followed. It is such a small sentence, almost too small for the years it would carry, but it is the sentence that turned a roadside incident into a missing person investigation and, eventually, into one of the most discussed unsolved cases in America. Imagine standing there afterward, as an officer or searcher or family member, while the cold presses in and the road looks ordinary again, and try to understand how a person could leave such a contained place so quickly. You would look east and west, toward the dark line of pavement, toward homes set back from the road, toward woods and driveways and snowbanks, and every direction would seem possible for a moment before it became uncertain. The car itself became a kind of silent witness, though silent witnesses are difficult because they offer traces, not explanations. Investigators looked at what was inside, what was outside, what seemed disturbed, what seemed ordinary, and what suggested that Maura had expected to continue somewhere rather than vanish from the known world altogether. In patient casework, an abandoned vehicle is never only a vehicle, because it is a container of intention, accident, habit, and interruption. Clothes, papers, personal items, and the condition of the car all become questions, and the person studying them has to resist both extremes, refusing to treat every object as a message, while also refusing to dismiss what might be important. The first night carried the awkwardness that many missing person cases carry before everyone agrees how serious they are. There is a line investigators come to understand too well. The line between someone who may have walked away briefly and someone who is in danger, and in real life that line can be faint, especially when the person is an adult and the first facts are still arriving. By the following day, the concern had sharpened, and the work began to widen beyond the roadside. Names were called, agencies became involved, family members traveled, and the ordinary bureaucratic language of reports and notifications began to gather around a private family fear that no form could ever quite hold. You can picture the early search as a slow, widening circle, people moving through cold air with practical tasks in front of them, calling, looking, noting tracks, checking places where someone might have gone for shelter, and trying to move carefully before weather and time erased what little the land might have remembered. Search work in winter has its own quiet severity, because snow can reveal and conceal at the same time, and the woods do not explain which marks are recent, which are old, and which have nothing to do with the person being sought. New Hampshire Fish and Game became part of the search effort, and searches would continue in different forms over time, with trained people bringing method to an area that was both rural and difficult. A dog reportedly followed a scent only a limited distance from the crash area before losing it, and that detail, like so many in this case, became both important and inconclusive. A scent trail ending does not necessarily tell you why it ended, and an investigator has to hold many possibilities without choosing one too early. A person may enter a vehicle, step onto a different surface, move where scent is harder to follow, or the conditions may simply refuse to preserve the path, and so the ending of the trail becomes not an answer, but another careful mark in the margin. For the family, the investigation was never an abstraction, because each lead was attached to hope, and each quiet interval had to be endured in real time. Fred Murray, Maura's father, became one of the central figures in the long search. persistent in a way that is difficult to summarize without flattening it, because persistence over years is not one emotion but many, repeated through calls, visits, appeals, interviews, searches, and the steady refusal to let a daughter's name fade. If you are the detective reading the case years later, you encounter not only the evidence but also the family's endurance. And you have to understand that the case file is not the whole case. Outside the file are birthdays, anniversaries, family conversations, rooms where someone's absence remains arranged among the living, and a kind of grief that cannot complete itself because the central question remains open. This is why cold cases have a different rhythm from fresh investigations. At first, the work is immediate and practical, but later the work becomes archival, comparative, almost monastic, as people reread interviews, recheck old assumptions, and look for the overlooked detail that was too small to recognize when everything was new. The Maura Murray case became, over time, a case of revisiting. Investigators revisited the road, the car, the timeline, the witness accounts, the calls, the searches, the surrounding properties, and the public tips that came in from people who were certain, uncertain, mistaken, sincere, or simply trying to help. Every old investigation develops a landscape of tips, and most of them lead nowhere, not because people are careless, but because memory is a soft instrument and time changes the shape of what people think they saw. Someone remembers a figure on a road, someone remembers a vehicle, someone remembers a conversation at a store, someone remembers something that only later seemed related, and the detective's task is to listen without surrendering the case to noise. The investigator in such a case has to be both open and restrained, which is harder than it sounds. Too much skepticism can close a door that should have stayed ajar, while too much belief can turn the investigation into a maze of imagined connections. And so the patient detective learns to ask, again and again, what can be verified, what can be compared, and what remains only possible. There were reported sightings and possible leads over the years, some near the general time of the disappearance, and some much later, and each one had to be weighed against distance, timing, description, weather, and the reliability of recollection. In a case this widely discussed, a lead can arrive already surrounded by public theory, and investigators have to strip away the surrounding story until only the testable part remains. This is not glamorous work, though it is often the most important work. It means checking maps, comparing call times, reading old statements closely, calling someone back years later, asking whether a memory has changed, and understanding that a person may be telling the truth as they remember it, while still being wrong about the date. The road itself became familiar to people who had never been there, because maps and photographs made it possible for strangers to study the curve and measure the distances from their own homes. But for investigators and searchers, the road was not symbolic at first. It was physical, cold, sloped, wooded, bordered by homes and driveways, and connected to other roads that led into a region where darkness and weather could make distance feel larger than it looked on paper. When you imagine investigating that road, you should not imagine a dramatic tableau, but a practical landscape of questions. Where could someone walk in a few minutes? Where would headlights be visible? Where might a driver stop? Where were the nearest houses? Where were the snowbanks high enough to matter? And how far could a person go before the first responders arrived? The answers never settled into one clean shape, and this is part of why the case endured. There was no single piece of public evidence that explained whether Maura left on foot, accepted a ride, tried to hide, went toward a home, moved into the woods, or encountered someone whose presence never became part of the record. An investigator may form working theories because theories are tools, but in a case like this they have to remain provisional, soft at the edges, and always answerable to the evidence. The danger is not having a theory. The danger is becoming loyal to it, because loyalty belongs to people, not to explanations. At the university, investigators and others tried to understand Maura's days before she left, and those days brought their own quiet complications. There had been stress, there had been personal concerns, there had been incidents that became part of public discussion, and yet none of that can be made to explain her disappearance without care. Young adulthood can leave records that look strange later, because life at that age is often unfinished, reactive, private, and full of decisions that make sense only from inside the moment. When investigators look backward, they have to remember that every person's final known days become overinterpreted once the person is missing, and the ordinary untidiness of life can begin to look like a coded message, even when it may only be life. This does not mean the details do not matter. It means they matter in proportion, and proportion is one of the quiet virtues of patient investigation. A compassionate detective can acknowledge that Maura may have been under strain, and at the same time refuse to treat strain as an answer, because people under strain still deserve to be searched for, listened for, and understood as more than their hardest moments. In the files, the last day has the character of a path that can be followed only part way. You can trace Maura from campus activity to travel preparations, from the Amherst area northward, from the broad geography of Massachusetts into New Hampshire, and then to Route 112, where the record tightens and then opens into silence. That silence is not empty, though. It is filled with responders, family, dogs, searches, interviews, maps, legal requests, news reports, public interest, private grief, and the long institutional memory of a case that moved from urgent search to cold case without ever ceasing to matter. Over the years, the investigation became layered because new people came to it with new questions, while older participants carried memories from the first days. Law enforcement agencies held information that was not fully public. The family sought answers and records, and the public tried, sometimes helpfully and sometimes not, to make sense of the unknown. In 2006, Fred Murray's effort to obtain investigative records reached the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and the legal dispute itself became part of the case's long history. That kind of records fight can feel distant from the roadside, but it belongs to the same larger story because families of missing people often live at the boundary between wanting transparency and being told that some information must remain protected for the sake of the investigation. For investigators, withholding information can be a way to preserve the usefulness of certain details, especially if a case might someday lead to prosecution, or if false confessions and false tips need to be tested against facts known only to police. For families, the same withholding can feel like being kept outside the room where the truth about their loved one is being handled, and both realities can exist at once, painfully and imperfectly. This tension is not unique to Maura's case, but the Murray family's persistence made it especially visible. The public could see a father asking for more, agencies saying they could not release everything, and a case suspended between private loss and public interest, with the missing person herself at the center of a conversation she never asked to become. When you think about what it was like to investigate the case, you have to include that human pressure, because detectives were not working in an empty room. They were working while a family waited, while media attention grew, while online communities formed, while theories multiplied, and while each anniversary returned with the same unanswered question. The internet changed the life of this case in ways that older investigators could not have fully anticipated. What might once have remained a regional missing person case became a widely discussed mystery, and with that attention came renewed awareness, but also speculation, repetition, and the strange permanence of online certainty. A patient detective has to move differently from the internet. The internet can leap, but the detective must walk. The internet can connect two facts because they feel related, but the detective has to ask whether they are related in a way that can be shown. The internet can keep a name alive which matters, but it can also create echoes so loud that the original voices become harder to hear. There is a tenderness required when discussing a case like this, because every theory touches real people. Neighbors, witnesses, family members, former classmates, responders, and strangers whose names entered the public conversation all became part of a living case. And the responsible investigator knows that suspicion is not a harmless weather passing over a person's life. So you return to the evidence with a slower hand. You read what was reported, you separate public fact from rumor, you mark what law enforcement has confirmed, you leave aside what cannot be responsibly carried forward, and you remind yourself that patience is not passivity, but discipline. By 2009, Maura's case had been associated with cold case work in New Hampshire, and the years had begun to change the nature of the search. Cold case does not mean forgotten, despite the phrase people sometimes use. It means the first heat of the investigation has passed, and what remains must be worked with endurance, memory, and sometimes new tools that were not available or not fully useful at the start. The cold case investigator inherits both evidence and time. Time can damage a case because witnesses move, memories soften, landscapes change, and records may be incomplete. But time can also create openings because relationships change, loyalties shift, technology improves, and someone who was silent once may later decide to speak. In Maura's case, the hope has often rested not on one spectacular discovery, but on the possibility that a small withheld fact, a preserved item, a refined search, a better interview, or a single honest tip could finally narrow the unknown. That is the rhythm of many old cases, where the answer, if it comes, may arrive quietly, almost administratively, through a phone call, a lab result, a property search, or a person deciding that enough years have passed. There have been searches over the years in different places, including renewed efforts prompted by information, tips, or investigative judgment, and each one carries a particular kind of solemn practicality. Searchers do not go into a landscape with certainty, they go with a question, and they accept that a careful search may end by finding nothing, which is still information, though never the kind the family most wants. To investigate this case is to learn the emotional weight of negative results. A searched area that yields no answer can remove one possibility or weaken one lead, but it does not bring Maura home, and it does not explain what happened after the crash. The file may become more accurate while the central grief remains unchanged. The FBI has carried Maura's information through its missing person and violent crime resources, noting her disappearance from Haverhill, the black Saturn, the snow-covered roads, and the fact that she was not at the crash scene when police arrived. In February of 2024, an age-progressed image was released showing an impression of what she might look like years later. A reminder that official attention can continue even when time has moved far beyond the person's last confirmed day. Age progression is a quiet and difficult tool because it asks the public to imagine a missing person as time might have carried them forward. It is not a declaration that the person is alive, and it is not a conclusion. It is a bridge between the face people remember and the possibility that someone, somewhere, might recognize an adult woman whose life has been hidden from view. For the family, such tools can be both necessary and painful. They keep Maura's name present, and they invite new attention, but they also require loved ones to meet an image of years that were not shared, birthdays that passed without certainty, and a future that had to be imagined because the present never gave them answers. In the patient work of investigation, one learns that photographs are among the most powerful and most limited objects in a file. A photograph can restore personhood when a case has become too theoretical, but it cannot tell you where someone went, whom they trusted, whether they was afraid, or what happened in the space after the last known contact. That is why investigators keep returning to ordinary records. They return to the dispatch log, the statement from the bus driver, the timing of the police arrival, the search conditions, the contents of the car, the family statements, the university records, and the many later tips that must be placed carefully beside the known timeline. You can imagine a cold case detective sitting at a desk years later with a map open and old reports spread nearby, not looking for drama but for alignment. Does this witness account fit the known time? Does this location make practical sense? Does this tip include information known before it was public? And does this recollection become stronger or weaker when placed beside the record? There is a special patience in rereading witness statements, because the first reading often looks for information, while later readings look for structure. A detective may notice what the witness was certain about, and what they only assumed, what they saw directly, and what they heard from someone else, what time they gave, and how that time was established. Because in old cases, the strength of a detail often depends on the scaffolding beneath it. The public sometimes asks why a case remains unsolved when so many people have looked at it, and the answer is rarely simple. Some cases remain open because the crucial event happened in a brief interval, because the landscape offered too many directions, because the person left few confirmed traces, or because the only person who knows the answer has never spoken. The Maura Murray case contains all the quiet frustrations that can make an investigation last for decades. There is a narrow timeline, but not enough certainty inside it. A known starting point, but no known destination. a family that has searched relentlessly, and a public record large enough to invite study, but incomplete enough to resist closure. If you are the investigator, you learn to be careful with the word impossible. It is tempting to say that someone could not have walked far, could not have vanished so quickly, could not have entered a vehicle unseen, could not have avoided discovery in such a searched area. But patient casework teaches that human movement in darkness can be unexpectedly difficult to reconstruct. At the same time, you learn to be careful with the word obvious. It may feel obvious to one person that Maura left voluntarily, obvious to another that she met with foul play, obvious to another that she sought shelter and was lost, but a feeling of obviousness is not evidence. And old cases are often harmed when certainty arrives before proof, so the better posture is quieter. You can say that the publicly known facts allow several possibilities, that some are more consistent with the record than others, and that investigators may know things the public does not. But the final answer has not been established in a way that can be responsibly spoken as truth. There is dignity in that restraint, though it can feel unsatisfying. To say, "we do not know," is not to give up. It is to protect the missing person from being overwritten by a story that may be wrong. It is to leave room for the actual answer, whatever it may be, to arrive without having to fight through years of confident invention. In the first days after Maura disappeared, the work would have felt physical, urgent, and cold. People searched roadsides and woods, made calls, checked possibilities, and tried to understand whether she had moved with purpose, panic, concealment, or the simple instinct to get away from an accident scene before help arrived. Later, the work became more relational and archival. Investigators spoke to people again, compared accounts, followed leads that came from media attention, received calls from people who believed they knew something, and continued the quieter process of deciding which doors should be reopened and which had already been carefully checked. There are cases where one decisive object changes everything, but there are also cases where the work advances by subtraction. A property search finds nothing. A reported sighting cannot be matched. A rumor loses its footing. A person of interest is considered and not confirmed. And slowly the case becomes a map not only of possibilities but of possibilities tested and found wanting. For a family, subtraction rarely feels like progress because it does not answer the central question. Yet for an investigator, removing what is false matters deeply, since a case crowded with false paths can become almost impossible to move through, and every cleared path may bring the remaining unknown into sharper relief. The emotional geography of this case includes Amherst, Hanson, Haverhill, Woodsville, the White Mountains, and the many places where Maura's name has been spoken over the years. Each location holds a different kind of meaning. Because campus belongs to her life before, the road belongs to the last confirmed evening, and the mountains belong partly to who she was, a runner and hiker whose familiarity with effort and distance has shaped how people imagine her choices. But familiarity with the outdoors is not an answer either. It may inform what she could have done, what she might have attempted, and how searchers thought about her abilities, but it does not decide whether she stayed near the road, accepted help, walked away, or was drawn into circumstances nobody witnessed. This is how every detail in the Maura Murray investigation seems to behave. It gives light, but not enough light. It points, but not all the way. It matters, but it must be held alongside other details that matter too. And the investigator's task is to keep them in conversation without forcing them into a shape they have not earned. The car on Route 112 remains the central object because it is the place where public certainty ends. Before the car, there are movements that can be partly documented. After the car, there are possibilities. It is natural for attention to gather there, at the roadside, because it is the last place where the story can be touched by confirmed fact. If you place yourself there gently, not as a thrill seeker, but as a patient reader of the landscape, you notice the curve, the houses, the way a rural road can be both inhabited and lonely. A person can be seen and missed there within minutes, especially in winter darkness, when headlights make brief tunnels of visibility and everything outside them returns to shadow. The responding officer's arrival time, the bus driver's account, the neighbor's call, and the tow of the vehicle have all been studied because the timeline between Maura being seen and not being found is so small. Small intervals matter in investigations, and they can become almost meditative in cold case work, because a few minutes may contain the whole unknown. You turn those minutes over slowly. Did she leave immediately? Did she hesitate? Did another vehicle pass? Did she move east-west? Toward a house? Toward darkness? Toward what she thought was safety? Or away from what she thought might become trouble? The questions are simple, and that is why they last. No responsible retelling can answer them by imagination. It can only acknowledge them, lay them down carefully, and continue following the patient work that grew from them. The investigator must respect the silence at the center of the case, because silence can be distorted if one speaks too loudly over it. As the years passed, Maura's family continued to advocate, search, speak publicly, and ask for attention from officials and the public. Their persistence is part of the investigative story, because cold cases often survive through a combination of official responsibility and family insistence. And without family voices, some files grow quiet in ways they should not. There is a particular kind of courage in repeating the same request for years. Please look again. Please search here. Please release what can be released. Please do not forget her. Please understand that behind this file is someone loved. Those requests may sound simple from the outside, but they require the endurance of living beside uncertainty every day. Investigators, too, can carry a case privately. A detective may retire with certain names and timelines still present in memory. A searcher may remember the weather. A dispatcher may remember the call. A neighbor may remember the sound outside. And each person holds a small fragment of a night that never entirely returned to ordinary life. This is one of the deeply human things about old investigations. They are not only records kept by institutions, they are memories kept by people. And people age, move, change, and sometimes come back to what they knew with a different understanding than they had before. In a case like Maura's, the passage of time also changes the public. People who first heard about her as a young nursing student now have children older than she was when she vanished, and the case has moved from contemporary news into the long, dim corridor of unresolved American mysteries. Yet unresolved does not mean unreal, and the years do not make the person at the center any less present. To investigate after many years is to work against fading. You look for documents before they are lost. You preserve interviews while witnesses can still clarify them. You digitize what once sat in boxes. You compare old notes against newer leads, and you accept that some opportunities may have passed while others may still be waiting. The evidence sitting in storage has its own quiet symbolism, but it is not only symbolic. Items preserved from an old case may someday be examined with better tools, or compared against new information, or used to test a statement from someone who comes forward long after the first search. A box in evidence storage can look still, but in the life of an investigation, it is a kind of held breath. Cold case units exist partly because the past is not finished with us. A file can seem dormant and then move because of a new technology, a new witness, a database match, a fresh set of eyes, or a small contradiction that becomes visible only after the case has been rearranged by time. Patient detective work trusts that possibility without pretending it is guaranteed. In Maura's case, the hope for movement has often been tied to both human information and careful review. Someone may remember, someone may reconsider, someone may know more than they have said, or an old detail may finally be understood in relation to another old detail that had been sitting nearby all along. That is the quiet art of reinvestigation. It is not simply reading the file again, it is reading it as if it were both familiar and new, honoring the work already done while asking whether the first shape of the case caused later readers to miss something near the edge. Every investigator brings a frame to a case, and the first frame can be powerful. If early thinking leans toward one possibility, later leads may be interpreted through that possibility, sometimes appropriately and sometimes too narrowly. Revisiting a case means asking not only what the evidence shows, but also how earlier assumptions guided the search for evidence. With Maura, public debate has often circled around those early assumptions, especially questions about whether she intended to disappear, whether she was in distress, whether she met someone after the crash or whether something happened nearby that searchers could not find. A careful narrator does not need to choose among these in order to honor the investigative experience, because the experience itself is one of weighing, returning, and waiting. Waiting is not empty in this case. It includes anniversaries, press conferences, podcasts, family statements, official postings, searches, renewed attention, and the small everyday acts by which a missing person remains in the world. A blue ribbon, a photograph, a website, a tip line, a remembered road, and a father's repeated words all become part of how the case continues. Yet, the center remains quiet. A young woman left campus, her car was found in New Hampshire, and when help arrived, she was not there. Everything else gathers around those facts like winter branches around a small patch of sky. To write or speak about Maura Murray responsibly is to avoid turning that patch of sky into a storm. It is enough to say that the case asks for patience, because every unsolved case asks us to tolerate what we do not know while still caring enough to keep looking. The investigative life of the case teaches a slow lesson about humility. We can know the date, the road, the car, the weather, the school, the approximate time, and some of the last confirmed movements, and still not know the thing everyone most wants to know. Facts do not always form a conclusion, and sometimes the most honest work is to keep them safe until they can. So you sit with the file as night deepens, and the details become familiar in the way old pages become familiar under a quiet hand. The name Haverhill, the road Route 112, the Black Saturn, the snow-covered evening, the university in Amherst, the family from Massachusetts, the searches in New Hampshire, the official notices, the age-progressed image, the years of asking. You do not need to force the case to speak before it is ready. You can let it remain what it is, an unresolved disappearance investigated through roads, records, searches, courts, family persistence, public attention, and the long patience of people who have not stopped hoping that the right detail will one day come into view. And sometimes, in the quietest part of an investigation, the work is not about moving forward at all, but about returning with cleaner eyes to what has already been gathered. You take the earliest accounts, the ones made when the snow was still fresh and the calls were still new, and you lay them beside later memories, not to accuse anyone of changing a story, but to understand how memory settles, shifts, and sometimes protects itself. A person who saw a car by the road may remember the angle more clearly than the clock, while another may remember the feeling of the evening better than the exact sequence of minutes. This is why investigators ask the same careful questions again, even when they seem simple. Where were you standing? Which direction were you looking? What lights were on? What did you hear first? And how did you know the time? These questions may sound ordinary, almost plain, but in a case where the known world narrows to a roadside and a small interval of darkness, ordinary questions become the tools by which uncertainty is gently measured. You can imagine the first reports as stones placed in a shallow stream, with water moving around them and snow gathering at the banks. The stones are real, but the water's always moving, and years later the investigator must decide which stones are still firm enough to step on. It is patient work, and it asks for a temperament that can live with partial answers without becoming careless or cold. There were homes near the crash site, and that matters, because rural does not always mean empty. A person standing near a car might be close enough to a porch light to feel seen, and yet far enough from help to feel alone, especially when winter and worry have begun to press against the edges of thought. Investigators had to consider that strange mixture of visibility and isolation, the way a person may be noticed in one moment and then pass beyond notice in the next. The houses became part of the geography of the case, not because they solved anything, but because every investigation must understand its setting with humility. Windows, driveways, tree lines, bends in the road, and the reach of headlights all become part of the practical imagination of the detective, who has to reconstruct not a movie scene, but a real winter evening in a real community, where people were making dinner, answering phones, and looking out at the weather. The weather itself deserves patience. Snow does not merely decorate a case like this, it changes sound, footing, speed, visibility, and the way a landscape holds traces. It can make the world seem quieter while also making movement more difficult, and it can preserve a track in one place while losing it in another, especially along a road where vehicles, responders, and later searchers may disturb the surface. For searchers, winter brings both help and frustration because fresh snow can reveal what the eye might otherwise miss, though it can also soften or cover the very signs people hope to read. A track leading into the woods would matter, but the absence of such a track does not always carry the simple meaning people want it to carry. Weather is evidence only in a limited way, and like all evidence, it has to be interpreted within the conditions that shaped it. So a patient investigator asks what the searchers saw, where they searched, how soon they searched, and what the ground conditions allowed them to know. These are not dramatic questions, but they are the kinds of questions that decide whether one theory is practical, whether another is strained, and whether a third should remain quietly possible. In cold casework, practicality is often kinder than certainty because practicality stays close to what can be tested. There is also the question of movement along the road, and you can sit with it for a long time. If Maura moved away from the car on foot, then distance, direction, clothing, weather, and time all matter. If she entered another vehicle, then the road's traffic, sightlines, and timing matter in another way. The case does not let you choose easily, because each possibility has places where it seems to fit, and places where it begins to loosen. A theory may begin with confidence and then, under the weight of small facts, grow less certain. A person could have walked, but how far before being seen? A person could have accepted a ride, but from whom and under what circumstances? A person could have sought shelter, but where and why did the following searches not find her? Those questions are not meant to hurry the mind. They are meant to slow it down the way a careful reader slows down over a handwritten note, noticing not just the words but the pressure of the pen, the spacing, the way one line leans into another. Every old case asks to be read in that manner, with attention not only to what is present, but also to what is missing. Maura's life before that evening has often been studied, and here again the work requires restraint. There were stressors, there were decisions that seemed unusual later, and there were details that became public, because disappearance turns private life into investigative terrain. But the compassionate investigator remembers that privacy does not vanish simply because a case becomes famous, and that a missing person should not be treated as though every difficult moment was a clue pointing directly toward fate. It is possible to acknowledge that the days before the disappearance were complicated, without making those complications carry more weight than they can bear. Many people leave behind unanswered calls, strained conversations, errands, misstatements, and sudden changes of plan, and most of them return home to explain themselves in ordinary words. Maura did not return to explain, and so the ordinary has been left suspended, studied from every side under the pale light of afterward. That is one of the saddest distortions in missing person work. The missing lose the ability to clarify their own actions, and others must speak carefully around the silence they leave. A decision that might have been explained in one tired sentence becomes, over years, a subject of interviews, theories, and speculation, and the absence of explanation can make even small choices look larger than they were. The investigator's responsibility then is to let the small remain small unless the evidence asks otherwise. A purchase remains a purchase, a drive remains a drive, a message remains a message, and only when these things align with other reliable facts should they begin to bear more meaning. This restraint can feel slow, but slowness is not weakness. In a case like this, slowness is a form of respect. The road north from Amherst to New Hampshire has its own quiet place in the file, because it marks the passage from the known routines of campus into a more uncertain geography. Investigators could ask why she traveled, where she intended to go, whether she had a destination in mind, and whether the route itself was purposeful, improvised, familiar, or chosen for reasons that remain private. Each of those questions opens another door, and behind each door is a room with only partial light. Travel records can sometimes tell a clear story, but here they do not complete the picture. There are places she may have considered, places she had known, places she might have been drawn toward, and places that later researchers have suggested because of maps and memories. Yet the final confirmed stop is not a lodging desk or a friend's driveway or a trailhead. but the side of a winter road in Haverhill. This is why the investigation keeps folding back to that road, no matter how far outward the theories reach. You may study the university, the family history, the calls, the computer searches, the money, the car, and the larger region, but eventually the file returns to the curve where the Saturn stopped. The roadside is the hinge of the case, and everything before and after turns quietly around that place. In the years that followed, some people approached the case as a question of geography, using maps, terrain, weather, and search patterns to imagine where a person might have gone. Others approached it as a question of human contact, wondering who might have passed by, who might have stopped, and whether a brief meeting could have carried Maura away from the last place she was seen. Investigators had to consider both kinds of thinking, while also remembering that maps and people are each incomplete in their own way. A map can tell you distance, but not fear, hesitation, confusion, or trust. A witness can tell you a memory, but not always its exact time or full context. A road can show where travel was possible, but not why one direction would have felt safer than another. And a detective has to hold all of that at once without letting the case become too tidy. The wooded areas near and beyond the crash site have been searched and discussed for years, and the possibility that Maura entered the woods has remained part of the broader public conversation. Searchers, dogs, terrain experts, and investigators have all contributed pieces to that question, yet the absence of a confirmed discovery has kept the matter unsettled. In an old case, even a thoroughly searched area can become the subject of renewed attention because people know that landscapes are large and searchers, however careful, are still human. There is no shame in that truth. Searchers do extraordinary work, but no search can make the earth entirely transparent, especially across time, weather, terrain, and the changing information that guides where people look. A careful search that finds nothing should be honored for what it is, an act of service and discipline, even when it cannot provide the answer everyone hoped would rise from the ground. The possibility of a ride has its own quiet complications. If Maura entered a vehicle, then the case becomes dependent on a person or persons who may never have been identified, and the road becomes not the end of movement, but the beginning of a hidden second route. Investigators would have to think about vehicles in the area, local drivers, passing motorists, timing, and whether anyone's later statements failed to fit what was known. But the ride theory also requires caution, because it can easily become a blank screen on which any imagined driver is projected. Patient detective work resists that temptation. It asks what vehicles were reported, what accounts can be corroborated, what opportunities existed in the narrow window, and whether any person has been placed there by evidence rather than by suspicion. The unknown driver, if there was one, remains unknown. That sentence should be allowed to stay plain. It is a possibility, not a conclusion, and its strength depends on facts that are not fully available to the public and perhaps not fully known to anyone. At the same time, the possibility that Maura left on foot also remains difficult. If she walked, she had to move quickly enough not to be found when responders arrived, and she had to continue in conditions that would have challenged anyone, even someone athletic and accustomed to effort. If she left the roadway for cover or shelter, then search conditions and terrain become central. If she stayed near the road, then the absence of a later confirmed sighting becomes puzzling. This is the case's recurring shape. One explanation begins to make sense, and then an opposing fact or absence asks it to slow down. Another explanation rises, then finds its own difficulty. The investigator learns not to become impatient with this rhythm, because the rhythm may be telling the truth about the state of the evidence. You can sit at a desk years later and build a chart of possibilities, but the chart will not recreate the cold, the worry, the sound of tires on snow, or the private thoughts of a young woman near a damaged car. This is why the human element must remain close to the investigative one. Evidence can guide, but it cannot fully replace the lived moment at the center of the file. Maura may have been trying to solve a short-term problem, may have been trying to avoid a consequence, may have been trying to reach a destination, or may have been acting under pressure that no record fully preserved. Each possibility deserves careful language because none of them removes her humanity, and none should be used to make her seem less worthy of being found. The missing do not have to be perfect to deserve our patience. The people who investigated the case early on had to make decisions with incomplete information, and it is easy years later to imagine that hindsight would have solved everything if only it had arrived on time. But investigations unfold in real minutes, with limited personnel, uncertain facts, and competing interpretations. And the first people on scene often cannot know which detail will become central after years of analysis. This does not mean early decisions should never be reviewed, only that they should be reviewed with the humility that comes from understanding the pressure of the first night. There are always questions in old cases about what might have been done differently. Could the perimeter have been wider? Could more homes have been checked sooner? Could certain items have been handled another way? Could the family have been told more? Could the public have been asked different questions? These are not useless questions because they help future cases, but they cannot be allowed to become a substitute for the harder present task of still looking for Maura. Patient investigation is partly the art of refusing despair. It says that even if the first night cannot be changed, the file can still be read, leads can still be tested, memories can still be sought, and the land can still be reconsidered. The past is fixed, but the investigation is not always fixed, and that small difference has carried many cold cases toward answers after years of silence. There have been families in other cases who waited decades before a name, a location, or a laboratory result changed everything, and those histories have shaped the way people think about Maura's case. They remind investigators that time does not close every door, even though it closes many. They also remind families that hope can be practical rather than grand, tied to a phone number, a preserved item, a renewed search, or one person deciding to tell the truth. In Maura's case, hope has often had to be disciplined. It cannot rest on every rumor, because rumors exhaust the people who love the missing. It cannot treat every claimed sighting as a breakthrough, because false hope has weight. And yet, it cannot disappear entirely, because without hope, the patient work would become only paperwork. And this case has always been more than paper. The case file, if you imagine it, is not only a collection of reports. It is a record of people trying to care across time. Officers wrote what they saw, searchers walked where they could, family members pressed for answers, journalists asked questions, and strangers learnt Maura's name and carried it into new rooms, where someone perhaps might remember something useful. Some attention has helped. Public awareness can generate tips, encourage record preservation, and keep a missing person from being reduced to a line in an archive. But attention also has to be handled carefully, because the louder a case becomes, the more easily its facts can be surrounded by inventions that travel faster than corrections. The responsible investigator learns to move through that noise without contempt. People are drawn to mysteries because unanswered questions trouble the human mind. And many people who discuss a case are sincerely trying to understand. But sincerity is not the same as accuracy, and compassion for Maura requires more than interest. It requires a willingness to let unsupported ideas remain unsupported. That willingness can be difficult, especially in a case that feels so close to explanation. The crash site is known, the time is narrow, the people nearby are partly known, and yet the result is still unknown, which creates the strange impression that the answer must be just behind the next tree or inside the next statement. Many long unsolved cases have that quality, as if the truth is nearby but not reachable by ordinary light. You can feel that quality in the way people return to the timeline. They ask how many minutes passed between the last confirmed interaction and the arrival of police, whether another vehicle could have stopped in that interval, whether Maura could have walked beyond immediate sight, and whether someone nearby might have seen more than they realized. These are practical questions, but repeated over years, they become almost like a quiet ritual. The timeline is a slender thing, and yet it bears enormous weight. It holds the neighbor's call, the bus driver's stop, the arrival of law enforcement, and the discovery that Maura was gone. It also holds what cannot be filled in, and every investigator knows that an empty space in a timeline is not one empty thing, but many possible things competing in silence. When a timeline is that slender, even a small adjustment matters. A minute earlier or later can change whether a passing vehicle seems plausible, whether a walker could reach a certain point, whether a witness could have seen something, or whether two accounts can reasonably overlap. So the detective returns to clocks, call logs, dispatch records, recollections, and all the small imperfect instruments by which human beings try to pin time down. Time in an investigation is never as clean as time on a page. People estimate, watches differ, clocks are checked afterward, and a moment that felt brief may have lasted longer than memory allows. The patient investigator accepts this, not as an excuse for vagueness, but as a reason to build ranges instead of pretending every second can be recovered. This is one reason the case has invited so much debate. The official and public timelines offer structure, but not the kind of structure that closes the question. They give enough certainty to study and enough uncertainty to keep studying, and that combination has made the Maura Murray case one of those files people return to late at night, as if the next careful reading might finally align the pieces. But even when pieces align, a human being remains at the center. Maura was not a riddle invented for investigation. She was a young woman whose life was interrupted in a way that has never been explained. Every discussion of the route, the crash, the witnesses, and the theories should lead back to that simple truth, because without it, the case becomes too easy to handle and too easy to distort. The people who loved her did not experience the case as an abstract puzzle. They experienced it as absence arriving all at once and then staying, day after day, while official language turned their fear into categories: missing adult, possible lead. Search area, investigative file. Each phrase may be necessary, but none of them can contain the full ache of not knowing where someone has gone. For investigators, that family ache is both a pressure and a guide. It reminds them that a case is not solved by managing appearances, and it reminds them that clarity matters, even when clarity is limited. Families can endure many difficult truths, but uncertainty without explanation can become its own long weather, settling over every ordinary day. In the Maura Murray investigation, communication between authorities, family, and public has itself been a recurring part of the story. Questions about what was known, what could be released, what had to remain confidential, and what had been done all became part of the wider narrative. This is common in cold cases because time stretches the space between official process and family need, and that space can fill with frustration if it is not tended with care. Law enforcement often has reasons for holding certain details back, and those reasons can be legitimate. A detail known only to investigators may help evaluate a confession, test a tip, or protect the integrity of a future case. But when years pass without resolution, the withheld detail can begin to feel, to families and observers, like a door that is always closed from the inside. The balance is delicate. Too much disclosure can damage an investigation, while too little can damage trust. In Maura's case, that balance has been tested repeatedly, and anyone trying to understand the investigation has to recognize that trust itself can become part of the evidence landscape, shaping who speaks, who listens, and who believes that their information will be handled well. A cold case is not only solved by facts, it is sustained by relationships. A witness must trust enough to come forward, a family must trust enough to cooperate, agencies must trust one another enough to share what matters, and the public must trust that tips will be taken seriously even when they do not lead to visible movement. When trust frays, the work becomes harder, slower, and more lonely. Still, the work continued. Maura's name remained in official databases, in family appeals, in news reports, in long-form investigations, and in the memory of those who first responded to the call. Over time, the case became a kind of meeting place between old-fashioned detective work and the newer world of online research, public records, podcasts, forums, and digital maps. That meeting place can be useful, but it can also be uneasy. Online communities can preserve documents, compare timelines, notice inconsistencies, and keep pressure on institutions, but they can also turn living people into characters and treat uncertainty as permission to accuse. A calm investigation does not reject public interest, but it asks that interest to be disciplined, humble, and aware of its consequences. You, as the quiet detective in this retelling, would learn to listen for what is useful without absorbing the noise. You might read a thoughtful timeline created by someone outside law enforcement, then check its sources. You might consider a theory, then ask what facts it requires. You might hear a rumor repeated for the 100th time, then trace it back until it becomes clear that no one can say where it began. This tracing backward is one of the most important skills in a case shaped by public attention. A claim may sound established because it has been repeated, but repetition is not confirmation. The patient investigator follows the claim upstream, past articles and posts and conversations, looking for the first reliable source, and sometimes finding that the river began as only a small, uncertain spring. In a file as discussed as Maura's, that distinction matters. There are public facts, reasonable inferences, law enforcement statements, family statements, media interpretations, and then there are rumors that have dressed themselves in the clothing of fact. To investigate well is to keep those categories separate, even when the separation slows the story down. Slowness, again, is not the enemy. Slowness protects the case from becoming a tale told for excitement rather than understanding. It allows Maura to remain a person rather than a theory, and it allows witnesses and family members to remain human beings rather than pieces moved across a board. As years accumulated, the case also became a study in how place changes while a question stays the same. Roads are repaired, houses change owners, trees grow, snow falls and melts through many winters, and the exact look of the scene on the 9th of February becomes harder to recover with each passing season. Investigators may return with photographs and maps, but the land they stand on is never perfectly the land from the first night. This is true of every old outdoor case. The landscape becomes both witness and unreliable witness, holding some things and giving up others. A driveway may look the same but feel different. A tree line may have shifted, a structure may have been altered, and the imagination has to work carefully, guided by old images rather than present-day impressions alone. For that reason, photographs from near the time become precious. They show angles, snowbanks, road conditions, and the relationship between objects before memory and development have changed too much. Yet, photographs, like all records, are bounded by their frame, and what matters most in a missing person case may have happened just outside the frame, or just after it was taken, or before anyone thought to lift a camera. The investigator learns to respect the frame without being trapped by it. What is visible matters, what is not visible may matter too. This balance between what can be seen and what must be inferred is one of the quiet disciplines of working a case that began in darkness. And darkness is not only a symbol here. It affected what people could see, how far they could see, and how quickly a person could pass from one patch of visibility into another. In rural winter darkness, headlights and porch lights create small islands, and between them the road can become a series of soft black spaces where certainty does not travel far. If Maura moved through those spaces, the investigation had only a narrow chance to see her movement directly. If someone else moved through them, the same was true. The darkness did not create the mystery by itself, but it shaped the conditions under which the mystery became possible. You can feel the patience required simply to accept that. No dramatic answer is needed in this moment of the retelling, only the recognition that environment, timing, human choice, and chance sometimes meet in a way that leaves investigators with very little to hold. A case can turn on a missed glance, a passing car, a door not opened, a question not asked until later, and none of those things mean anyone failed to care. The early responders did what responders do. They answered a call, came to a road, found a vehicle, noted what could be noted, and began the process that later generations would examine in detail. It is easy for later readers to demand impossible foresight from them, but more useful to ask, calmly, what information they had at the time and what the scene reasonably seemed to be. That question does not close debate, but it makes debate fairer. A fair investigation is not one that avoids hard questions. It is one that asks them without rewriting the past into something clearer than it was. The first night of the Maura Murray case was not a completed map, but a series of human decisions made under uncertainty, and that uncertainty has never fully lifted. Later, as the case deepened, investigators and family members looked beyond the immediate area. They considered travel routes, possible destinations, known contacts, unfamiliar contacts, financial records, phone activity, and the many ordinary systems through which a person can sometimes be traced. In modern cases, these systems can speak loudly, but in early 2004 they were more limited. and the digital trail did not offer the clean, continuous path people might imagine now. That difference matters. Today, many people carry devices that record location, purchases, movement, and communication with astonishing detail. But Maura disappeared at a transitional moment, when cell phones existed but did not create the same dense web of data many investigations use now. The case therefore belongs partly to the older world, where interviews, road searches, paper records, and human observation carried more of the burden. Investigating in that world meant waiting on records, calling institutions, speaking to people face to face, and building timelines from fragments. It meant that a gap in communication could remain a true gap, not easily filled by tower data or app histories or automatic location logs. And once again, the investigator had to work inside absence, not as a poetic idea, but as the daily reality of the file. The absence of a confirmed phone call after the disappearance, the absence of a bank transaction, the absence of a verified sighting, and the absence of physical discovery all pressed on the case in different ways. Absence can suggest many things, but it rarely proves one thing by itself. It can point toward harm, concealment, voluntary separation, accident, or simply the failure of systems to capture what happened next. This is why old missing person cases can resist even sincere intelligence. A thoughtful person may study every publicly available fact and still arrive at uncertainty, not because they have missed the obvious, but because the obvious may not exist. The true answer may depend on a fact never made public, a witness who has not spoken, or an event that left no durable trace. So the investigation becomes, in part, an act of waiting for the missing fact. Not passive waiting, but active waiting, the kind that keeps the file organized, the tip line open, the family informed when possible, and the evidence preserved. It is waiting with hands still working. In Maura's case, that waiting has lasted through many winters. Each February returns the road to the season in which she vanished, and although the weather is never exactly the same, the month itself carries memory. For those who have followed the case, February is not only a calendar page, it is a reminder of snowbanks, early darkness, and a young woman whose last confirmed evening remains unfinished. Anniversaries are difficult in cold cases because they gather attention and grief together. Reporters may call, public posts may appear, officials may renew appeals, and family members may have to speak again about a loss that has never become old to them. The public may experience an anniversary as a moment of remembrance, but the family lives with the case on days when no one else is paying attention. That is another truth investigators learn. Public attention rises and falls, but private absence is constant. A case can trend, disappear from headlines, return in a documentary, fade again, and still remain present at the dinner table, in family photographs, in holidays, and in the quiet inward moments when someone wonders what else might be done. Fred Murray's long advocacy has often been described in public accounts, but beneath the public description is a simpler human reality. A father kept asking for his daughter. He went back to New Hampshire, spoke to officials, pursued records, gave interviews, searched, and carried Maura's name through years, when many people might have expected the story to fade. That kind of persistence can be hard for institutions to meet, because institutions move through procedures while families move through love. Procedures are necessary, but they can seem unbearably slow to someone whose child is missing. Love is necessary too, but it can push against the walls of procedure until everyone involved feels the strain. The best investigations recognize both. They do not treat family persistence as inconvenience, and they do not treat procedure as cruelty. They understand that the search for a missing person requires structure and emotion together, because structure without emotion becomes mechanical, while emotion without structure can scatter the work in too many directions. In this case, the structure has included agencies, search teams, official records, court proceedings, public appeals, and the ongoing classification of the matter as unresolved. The emotion has included grief, frustration, hope, anger, devotion, and the quieter forms of endurance that do not always appear in interviews. Together they form the long human weather around the investigation, and anyone retelling it gently has to make room for both forms. As you continue through the file, you come to understand that the case is not a single question, but a collection of related questions, each one waiting beside the others. Why did Maura leave campus? What was her intended destination? What exactly happened at the crash site? How did she leave that area? And why has no confirmed trace resolved the matter since? None of these questions can be answered fully in isolation, because each depends on the shape of the others. If she had a destination, the crash may have interrupted a plan. If she did not have a fixed destination, the road may represent a different kind of movement, more uncertain and private. If she left the scene to avoid immediate consequences, then her first steps may have been practical rather than mysterious, but what happened after those steps remains the deeper unknown. The investigator learns to distinguish between the mystery that brought Maura to the road and the mystery of what happened after she reached it. They may be connected, or they may not be. A person can make an unusual decision for one reason and then encounter an entirely separate danger, accident, or opportunity moments later. This possibility keeps the case open in more than one direction. The pre-disappearance behavior may explain why she was in New Hampshire, but it may not explain why she vanished. The roadside event may explain the disappearance, but it may not explain the earlier journey. Investigators have to consider both halves, without forcing them into one seamless story simply because a seamless story is easier to tell. Real life often resists seamlessness. People act from mixed motives, change plans, make private decisions, and encounter events they never anticipated. A case file, by contrast, wants sequence and causation, and the detective's work is to build those things only where the evidence allows. So you keep the sequence modest. Maura was at college, Maura left, Maura drove north. Maura's car was found after an apparent crash. Maura was seen near the car, and when police arrived, she was gone. That sequence is strong enough to begin with, but it is not strong enough to finish, and the space after it must remain carefully open. In the silence after that sequence, many people have placed theories, and some of those theories have been thoughtful, while others have been unfair. A compassionate retelling does not need to walk through every theory in detail, because not every theory deserves the same room. It is enough to say that investigators have had to consider voluntary disappearance, misadventure, outside involvement, and other possibilities, while measuring each against what is actually known. Voluntary disappearance is often raised in missing adult cases, and it must be considered, because adults can choose to leave. But in Maura's case, the absence of confirmed later activity has made that possibility difficult for many people to accept, especially given the passage of years. Still, difficulty is not disproof, and investigators must remain careful about what can and cannot be ruled out. Misadventure too must be considered, because winter, darkness, unfamiliar terrain, and emotional stress can combine in ways that lead a person away from help. Yet repeated searches and the lack of discovery complicate that possibility, creating the familiar cold case tension between what seems plausible at first and what remains unexplained after years of effort. The land may hide things, but investigators cannot simply assume that it did. Outside involvement is another possibility, and it carries a heavier emotional charge because it asks whether someone encountered Maura after the crash and caused or contributed to her disappearance. That possibility has been discussed widely, but responsible handling requires evidence, not only fear. In a narrow window on a rural road, an encounter is possible, yet possibility alone cannot identify a person or prove an event, and so each broad explanation remains incomplete. One has the problem of no confirmed later life, one has the problem of no discovery despite search efforts, and one has the problem of no publicly confirmed perpetrator or conclusive encounter. The investigator lives among these incomplete explanations not because they are satisfying, but because honest casework sometimes means keeping several doors partly open for a very long time. Over the years, certain properties, locations, and accounts have drawn attention, and law enforcement has sometimes searched or examined places based on information received. Such actions can look significant from the outside, and they may be significant, but they can also be part of the routine necessity of checking a lead. A search does not always mean belief. Sometimes it means responsibility. That distinction matters for the people connected to searched places. Public attention can turn an investigative step into a judgment, and that is not fair unless the evidence supports it. Patient investigation requires not only care for the missing, but care in how suspicion is handled, because wrongful suspicion can leave its own lasting harm. The case has also shown how a community can become part of a mystery it did not choose. Haverhill and the surrounding area became known to many outsiders because of Maura's disappearance, and local people found their roads, homes, and memories examined by strangers. Some helped, some spoke, some stayed quiet, and some likely grew tired of seeing their ordinary landscape transformed into an object of speculation. A calm retelling should remember them too. Communities near old cases often live with a double burden, wanting the missing person found while also wanting their own lives not to be reduced to the case. The road is a place of significance, but it is also a road people use to get home, to visit neighbors, to carry groceries, and to move through the small routines that existed before and after the night in question. That ordinariness does not lessen the mystery, it deepens it. The most troubling disappearances often happen not in remote theatrical places, but in ordinary locations where people can imagine themselves passing by, noticing something small, and only later learning that the moment mattered more than anyone understood. As the file grows older, investigators sometimes look for pattern and sometimes for anomaly. Pattern asks whether Maura's actions fit known behavior, known stress, known destinations, or known relationships. Anomaly asks what stands apart, what happened that day that did not fit, what item or movement or statement seems to lean away from the rest. Both approaches have value, but both can mislead. Patterns can make unusual events seem more predictable than they were, while anomalies can become exaggerated simply because a disappearance followed them. The investigator's discipline is to let the evidence decide weight, not the emotional pull of mystery. In Maura's case, anomalies have been studied intensely, from the decision to leave campus to the travel north to the roadside disappearance itself. Some may be directly relevant, some may be indirectly relevant, and some may be ordinary choices made strange only by what came afterward. Without Maura's own explanation, it is difficult to know which category each belongs to. This is why the case has a contemplative quality. It asks not only what happened, but how we should think about what happened when the person who could explain the beginning is absent. It asks how much meaning to place on incomplete behavior, how much trust to give memory, and how to keep compassion alive when curiosity becomes intense. The best answer is to move slowly. You let the facts remain facts, let the unknown remain unknown, and avoid using Maura's private struggles, if there were struggles, as shortcuts to an ending. You remember that a person can be vulnerable without choosing to vanish, and a person can make confusing choices without losing the right to be searched for with full seriousness. In the quiet room of the investigation, the phone records lie beside the maps, the search reports beside the witness accounts, and the family appeals beside the official statements. Nothing in that room shouts. It waits. And the person reviewing it late at night may feel that the work is less like solving a riddle and more like keeping faith with a question that has not yet found its answer. Keeping faith is not the same as believing every hope. It means believing that the truth matters even when it is slow, that carefulness matters even when certainty would be easier, and that Maura's name should be spoken with the softness owed to a real person whose life reached far beyond the facts in the file. There is a certain quiet discipline in saying her name without trying to own her story. Maura Murray belonged first to herself, then to the people who loved her, and only much later to the public record that formed around her disappearance. The investigator has to remember that order, because old cases can tempt people into thinking that access to facts is the same as access to a life, when a life is always wider, warmer, and more private than any case file can hold. So the file is opened again with care, and the day is approached not as a puzzle box, but as a sequence of human choices made under conditions we cannot completely see. There were practical acts, like leaving campus and driving north, and there were emotional currents that may have moved underneath those acts, perhaps strong, perhaps ordinary, perhaps confused. The work is to notice both without pretending that one explains the other. At the university, the hours before Maura left have often been treated like the first room in a longhouse, a room where every object has been inspected for meaning. Investigators and later observers have looked at messages, Conversations, reported stress, the borrowed feeling of a young adult trying to manage several pressures at once, and the ordinary campus landscape that continued around her as if nothing historic were happening. It is easy, years later, to see significance everywhere, but on that day, she was still one person among many, moving through a world that did not yet know it would be remembered. You can imagine the campus in February, with dirty snow along walkways, doors opening into fluorescent halls, coats hung over chairbacks, and the private pace of student life moving from errands to calls to plans. In that kind of place, people are always going somewhere, and a young woman carrying her own thoughts would not necessarily seem unusual, even if those thoughts were heavier than anyone knew. The ordinary world is often like that, giving people room to pass through it unnoticed. Investigators had to reconstruct that ordinary world after it was gone. They had to ask who saw her, who spoke to her, what she said, what she carried, whether she seemed upset, whether she seemed purposeful, and whether any observed detail could be trusted enough to help. These questions were not asked to invade her privacy, though they inevitably touched it, but because when a person disappears, ordinary interactions become the last bridge back to presence. Witnesses from before a disappearance occupy a difficult place. They may wish they had noticed more, or asked a question, or recognized a sign. Those signs are rarely clear while life is still happening. A person can seem quiet because they are tired, distracted because they are busy, or unsettled because they are young and under pressure, and only afterwards does the mind begin looking backward for warnings that may not have been visible. This backward looking can be painful, and investigators have to account for that pain. Someone remembering Maura from the days before may be carrying not only a recollection, but also the weight of wondering whether a different action might have changed something. Patient interviews leave room for that human complexity, because a witness is not a machine of memory, but a person trying to recover a moment that time has already begun to soften. The detective's notebook in such interviews becomes a place where uncertainty is recorded rather than erased. Words like perhaps, around, seemed, might have, and I think are not weaknesses. They are honest markers of how memory works. A good investigator does not bully those words into certainty, because false certainty can do more harm than a careful admission that a detail is incomplete. From campus, the attention moves to preparation. What did Maura take with her? What did she leave behind? And what did those choices suggest about the intended length or nature of the trip? In many investigations, belongings can speak with surprising clarity, but here their language is partial, suggesting movement and perhaps a short absence, while still leaving the purpose and destination unsettled. A packed item can mean planning, but not necessarily long-term planning. A left-behind item can mean intention to return, or haste, or simply the limits of what someone thought to bring. Investigators must be wary of reading too much into possessions, because people do not always pack logically, especially when they are tired, stressed, or trying to leave quickly. Still, the items matter. They are the tangible remains of a decision to go, and they connect the campus world to the road in New Hampshire. You can picture them being listed, handled, photographed, and stored, each object ordinary in itself, yet transformed by the absence of the person who could have explained why it was there. The car, too, had its own history before it became the last confirmed place. It was an older black Saturn, not a symbol at first, only a student's vehicle with problems and limitations, carrying Maura north through winter roads toward whatever plan or impulse had taken shape that day. Investigators would later examine its condition, its damage, and its contents, but before all that, it was simply the car she was driving. Older cars have a way of becoming intimate in an investigation because they carry traces of daily life. A wrapper, a note, a book, a piece of clothing, an old receipt, an empty bottle, or a forgotten scrap of paper can make the person seem briefly nearby. Yet they can also overwhelm the investigator with meaningless detail, and the task is to separate what belongs to the disappearance from what belongs only to the ordinary accumulation of living. That separation is never perfect. In the Maura Murray case, as in many cases, people have looked at the vehicle and wondered whether it shows an interrupted journey, a plan gone wrong, or a moment of panic and improvisation. The car gives evidence of being there, but not enough evidence of what came next, and so it remains both central and silent. When the Saturn came to rest near the curve, the case entered its most studied interval. The crash itself, often described as minor enough not to fully explain the disappearance, became a threshold between one kind of investigation and another. Before it, detectives could trace movement through systems and roads. After it, they had to understand absence in an open landscape under winter darkness. The first people nearby did not know they were entering a long case. They saw, or heard, or were told of a car off the road, and they responded as neighbors and citizens do by calling for help or offering it. These acts were small and practical, which is why they are worth respecting. They belong to the ordinary decency that appears before the larger meaning of an event is known. The bus driver's stop has remained one of the most discussed moments because it placed a living witness near Maura at the roadside. He offered help, according to the public accounts, and she did not accept it in the way one might expect if she had wanted immediate assistance. That refusal, if we may call it that, has been studied repeatedly, but it can be understood in several human ways without becoming strange. A young driver after an accident may feel embarrassed, worried about consequences, eager to avoid involvement, certain that help is already coming, or simply unwilling to accept help from a person she does not know. None of those possibilities requires drama, and none resolves the case. The moment matters because it is close to the disappearance, but its meaning remains gentle at the edges, not sharp enough to cut through the unknown. After the bus driver continued on, the interval narrowed. Calls were made, people looked from nearby homes, and the road held the kind of stillness that can surround an accident after the first sound has passed. In that interval, Maura either remained briefly and then left, or left almost at once, or entered a circumstance that has never been publicly established, and each option has been considered with care. The arrival of law enforcement marks the end of that interval in the public record. The vehicle was there. Maura was not. Those two facts have carried almost unbearable weight, because they are clear enough to establish the mystery and incomplete enough to preserve it. What would it have been like for the responding officer to stand beside that car and realize the driver was gone? At first, perhaps it would not have seemed as grave as it later became, because people sometimes leave accident scenes for reasons that are foolish, frightened, or practical. The officer would have had to manage the car, the scene, the information from witnesses, and the immediate assumption that the driver might be somewhere nearby. Only later would the absence widened. Only later would it become clear that this was not a matter of someone walking to a nearby house and returning, or hiding briefly and appearing once things settled. Old cases sometimes begin as small procedural uncertainties, and then the uncertainty keeps growing until everyone realizes they are standing inside something much larger than the first call suggested. This growing awareness is a hard thing to investigate because time is already moving. Minutes become hours. Footprints change. Vehicles pass, people go to sleep, and the first night begins to lose details, even while responders are still trying to gather them. The earliest hours of a missing person case are a race against ordinary life continuing, and ordinary life is always very good at covering its own tracks. By the next day, the search had a different shape. Maura was no longer merely the absent driver of a car. She was a missing young woman whose family needed to be reached, whose last known place needed to be examined, and whose possible paths needed to be considered before weather and time made them harder. Agencies came into the work, and the landscape around the road began to be studied in a more deliberate way. Searchers in winter move with a different attention than searchers in summer. Their eyes look for breaks in snow, disturbed banks, items dropped, paths of least resistance, and places where a person might have sought cover from wind or cold. They know that a person who is scared, injured, tired, or simply trying not to be seen may not move as search planners expect. Search planning is part science and part humility. Searchers use terrain, probability, behavior, weather, and known starting points, but they also know that human beings do not always follow models. A person may choose a difficult route because it feels hidden, avoid a house because they fear consequences, or move toward lights only to change direction when another vehicle appears. The dogs used in searches carry another kind of hope, because the idea of scent seems almost miraculous to those outside the field. A trained dog may indicate direction or presence in ways human senses cannot, and yet scent work depends on conditions, contamination, time, surfaces, and the specific circumstances under which the trail was laid and followed. When the scent reportedly ended near the road, people naturally wondered what that meant. It may have meant a vehicle, it may have meant a loss of scent, it may have meant something about conditions rather than about Maura's exact movement. Investigators had to consider these possibilities without treating the dog's work as either meaningless or definitive, because evidence rarely deserves either extreme. The ending of a scent trail can become strangely powerful in public imagination. It feels like a door closing in the middle of the road, and people want to know what stood on the other side. But in investigative practice, it is one piece among many, useful only when placed beside timing, terrain, witness reports, and the broader uncertainty of that evening. You can sit with the image of that scent trail for a while, not as proof, but as a metaphor for the whole case. It begins where Maura was known to be, moves a short distance through the world, and then fades. The work of everyone who has cared about this case has been to stand at that fading place and ask, with as much patience as they can manage, where it went. Over time, searches expanded and changed. Some were official, some were family-led or volunteer-supported, and some were shaped by new tips or renewed attention to specific places. Each search carried hope into the field, but hope had to walk at the pace of terrain, and terrain does not yield itself quickly. There is a quiet nobility in people searching land without certainty. They step through brush, snow, mud, or leaf litter, not because they know something will be found, but because not searching would leave a question untested. At the end of a long search day, when nothing has been found, the work can feel both worthwhile and painfully incomplete. For the family, each search may bring a complicated mixture of dread and longing. To find something could mean a form of answer no one wants, while to find nothing means the old question remains untouched. This is one of the cruel balances in missing person cases, and investigators who work with families learn to understand that every possible outcome carries a weight of its own. The Maura Murray case has also had to live with the pressure of theories that became attached to names, places, and rumors. Some of these ideas may have started from genuine questions, but the public nature of the case made them travel widely, sometimes far beyond what evidence could support. A responsible investigator must treat such theories with caution, especially when they risk harming people who have not been shown to have any involvement. Suspicion can be a necessary tool in detective work, but public suspicion can become untethered. In an official investigation, suspicion should be tested quietly, supported or weakened by evidence, and handled with the knowledge that a person's reputation is not a disposable object. In public discussion, suspicion often becomes a story, and stories are harder to correct once they have found an audience. This is why calm language matters. It is not simply an aesthetic choice for a sleep narration, it is an ethical choice in an unresolved case. Calm language keeps the mind from leaping too far, and it helps preserve the distinction between what is known, what is possible, and what has only been imagined. The known facts remain few enough to recite, but each one opens into complexity. Maura left campus. She traveled north. Her car was found in Haverhill after a roadside incident. She was seen near it. When police arrived, she was gone. Searches and investigations followed for years without a confirmed resolution. The simplicity of that outline is deceptive. Inside each sentence are sub-questions, and inside each sub-question are records, interviews, maps, memories, and judgments, made by people doing their best under imperfect conditions. The outline is a doorway, not a conclusion, and the patient investigator keeps walking through it without assuming the final room is near. At times, the case seems to ask whether Maura's disappearance was planned, accidental, opportunistic, or some combination that does not fit neatly into any category. Human events often resist categories because they are made of moods, decisions, chance encounters, and conditions no one controls. A person may begin a journey for one reason and end up in danger for another. That is one of the reasons investigators look both backward and forward from the crash. Looking backward asks why she was there. Looking forward asks where she went. The answer may require both, but it is also possible that the reason she drove north and the reason she vanished are not the same reason. This distinction is delicate but important. If someone leaves home or school because they are distressed, that does not mean distress caused everything that followed. If someone has private worries, that does not mean they intended permanent disappearance. If someone has an accident, that does not mean every later event was under their control. In a case this public, compassion often means refusing to simplify. Maura can be understood as a young woman under possible pressure, and also as a missing person who may have encountered circumstances beyond her choice. The investigation has to make room for all of that, because a life is rarely one line drawn cleanly from cause to consequence. The family's view has remained central to the moral shape of the case. They have often emphasized that Maura would not have simply abandoned them forever without contact, and that belief comes not from theory, but from relationship. Investigators may have to consider all possibilities, but family knowledge is also a kind of evidence in the broader human sense, though it must be weighed differently from records or physical findings. Families know patterns of love, habit, and character that no outsider can fully access. They may know what a person would never do, or what they might do only under extraordinary pressure. At the same time, investigators must remember that even loving knowledge has limits, because every person has private rooms that even family may not fully enter. So again, the work settles into balance. Listen to the family, study the records, respect the private life, follow the evidence, keep possibilities open without letting them become accusations. Return to the known facts whenever the mind begins to drift too far. The passage of years has changed how people imagine the case. In the early period, the question may have been where Maura was and whether she might return. Later, the question became what had happened, who might know, whether evidence had been missed, and whether a cold case approach could bring a new angle. The same disappearance became different kinds of investigation as time moved around it. In the first days, people searched for a living person nearby. In later months, they searched for clues, witnesses, records, and explanations. In later years, they searched through the past itself, asking whether something overlooked, withheld, misremembered, or misunderstood can still be recovered. Each phase has its own sorrow and its own discipline. The early phase is full of motion. The later phase is full of reading. The cold case phase is full of returning, comparing, and asking whether time has changed what can be known. Together they make a long investigation that feels less like a straight road than a series of circles around the same quiet place. There is no shame in circles, if each circle is careful. Detectives circle a case because the center has not yet opened. Families circle it because love has no final paperwork. The public circles it because unresolved stories ask something of the human imagination, though imagination must always be kept in its proper place. Imagine, then, the cold case detective receiving the file years later. Some pages are familiar from earlier reviews, some names have become prominent through public discussion, some leads are already marked as checked, and some details still carry the faint possibility of movement. The detective does not begin by declaring a theory, but by rebuilding the case from the ground upward, one fact at a time. They may create a new timeline, not because previous timelines were useless, but because rebuilding is a way of noticing. They may list every known call, every witness, every search area, every item from the car, every reported sighting, and every location where Maura may have intended to go. They may mark what is verified, what is second-hand, what is public, what is confidential, and what has been distorted through repetition. This kind of work is quiet enough to seem almost clerical, but clerical care can change cases. A date corrected, a name matched, a map rechecked, a tip placed in the right context, or an interview compared against its original report can shift the way the whole file is understood. In old investigations, accuracy is not decoration. It is the flaw beneath every possible step. The investigator may also ask which assumptions hardened too early. Was a particular route assumed because it seemed likely rather than because it was confirmed? Was a witness dismissed because their account did not fit the early theory? Was a search area prioritized for good reasons and were nearby alternatives considered with equal care? These questions do not accuse the past. They reopen it gently. Reopening is a delicate word. It suggests movement, but also tenderness, because old wounds reopen too. For families, every renewed investigation can bring hope and fear together. And for investigators, every renewed lead must be handled with the awareness that real people are listening for any sign that the long waiting may change. In Maura's case, renewed attention has come through official activity, family advocacy, media projects, and public discussion. Each new wave of attention has brought the possibility of a useful tip, but also the risk of reviving unhelpful speculation. The case has had to endure both gifts and burdens from the attention given to it. Media has played a complicated role, as it often does in cold cases. It can keep the missing person visible, bring forward witnesses, and pressure institutions to explain their work. It can also flatten complexity, repeat weak claims, or encourage the audience to seek narrative satisfaction where the evidence offers none. A calm listener, like a calm investigator, should receive media accounts as starting points rather than final authorities. What is the source? What is confirmed? What is interpretation? What is omitted? And how does the account treat the people involved? These questions help preserve the integrity of the case, especially when the story has been told many times in many tones. Tone matters because tone shapes attention. A sensational tone asks the listener to feel alarm, suspicion, and urgency. A patient tone asks the listener to notice, to wait, and to care without demanding immediate resolution. The Maura Murray case deserves the second kind of attention, because its facts are already heavy enough without being made louder. The investigation itself, at its best, is patient attention made practical. It does not need dramatic music or sharp turns. It needs organized records, honest interviews, preserved evidence, clear communication, and the humility to admit that a long unsolved case may still contain something no one has yet understood. You can imagine the file resting on a desk near the end of a workday, with the office lights low and the map of Haverhill still open. The detective has made notes, not final conclusions, and the notes are modest. Recheck timing, compare statements, follow up on property lead, confirm old record, speak again with witness if possible. This is how cases move, not always by revelation, but by lists carried patiently into another morning. Some mornings bring nothing. A phone call is returned and adds no new information. A record request produces a duplicate. A witness no longer remembers beyond what was already said, or a location search confirms only that the lead could not be supported. These are disappointing outcomes, but they are still part of the work, because the truth often requires learning what is not true. Other mornings may bring something small. A person clarifies a time. An old photograph shows a detail of the road. A former resident remembers a vehicle, or a document thought missing appears in a box. Most small things do not solve a case, but they can refine it, and refinement is one of the quiet forms of progress. Progress in a cold case is often invisible to the public. Investigators may be doing meaningful work that cannot be announced, or they may be waiting on information that is too fragile to discuss. Families may hear little and fear nothing is happening, while agencies may believe silence is necessary, and this gap can become one of the hardest parts of the long process. The Maura Murray case has lived inside that gap for many years. Publicly, there are known facts and periodic developments. Privately, there may be investigative details that remain held back. Between those spaces, the public builds questions, the family seeks clarity, and the missing person remains the reason any of it matters. It is worth pausing over that reason. Maura was 21, but 21 is not an ending age, it is a beginning age, full of unfinished roads. She had already been many things to many people, and she might have become many more. The investigation is not only about explaining a disappearance, but about honoring the life that should have continued beyond it. That honor requires accuracy. To say only what can be said is an act of care. To avoid embellishment is an act of care. To refuse gore, drama, and easy suspicion is an act of care. And to keep looking, even when the looking is slow, is perhaps the deepest act of care an investigation can offer. The case also invites reflection on how society responds to the missing. Some missing person cases receive enormous attention, while others are scarcely noticed, and those differences can reflect geography, race, class, media habits, family advocacy, and chance. Maura's case became widely known, and that visibility has helped keep her name present. But it also reminds us that every missing person deserves patient attention, whether or not the public ever learns their name. For investigators, each case is both individual and part of a larger duty. The methods used in one case, the mistakes recognized, the search protocols improved, and the communication lessons learned can carry forward to others. Even when a case remains unresolved, it can shape better care for the next family standing at the beginning of uncertainty. That is one of the few consolations available in old casework. The past cannot be repaired, but it can instruct. A delayed search can teach urgency, a communication gap can teach transparency, a records problem can teach preservation, and a long family struggle can teach institutions that patience should not be mistaken for silence. In Maura's case, the lessons are many, though none of them substitute for an answer. Preserve the first facts. Treat adult disappearances seriously when circumstances are unusual. Communicate with families carefully and consistently. Protect the integrity of evidence. Revisit assumptions. Accept public help without surrendering to public noise. And above all, remember the person at the center, because without that remembrance, the work loses its moral compass. The moral compass points back to a young woman on a cold road, not to a legend, not to an internet mystery, not to a story shaped for fear, but to Maura herself, standing somewhere in the last confirmed light of the case. Everything after that is investigation. And investigation, when done well, is a form of listening. Listening can take many forms. It can mean listening to a witness without rushing them, listening to the land through search patterns, listening to records through careful comparison, and listening to the family when they say that the person they love must not be forgotten. It can also mean listening to silence, which is harder, because silence does not tell you whether you are close. The silence in this case has lasted long enough to become part of its identity, but it has not erased the possibility of truth. Old cases have changed after longer intervals, sometimes through new evidence, and sometimes through old conscience. A person who thought a detail was unimportant may later understand it differently, or someone who was afraid to speak may find that time has loosened the hold of fear. This is why appeals continue. They are not merely formal gestures, they are invitations to memory and conscience. Someone may have seen something on the 9th of February, or heard something in the days after, or received a confidence years later, and may not understand that even a small detail could help when placed correctly in the timeline. Investigators often say that no detail is too small, and while that phrase can sound routine, it is true in a particular way. A small detail may be useless alone, but useful beside another detail. A vehicle description, a time estimate, a direction of travel, a comment made later, or an unfamiliar person in a familiar place may become meaningful only after the file has been waiting for its companion fact. The person holding such a detail may hesitate, especially after so many years. They may worry they are mistaken, or that their memory is too faint, or that they should have spoken earlier. A patient investigation leaves room for late speech, because shame over delay should not become another lock on information that might help. There is also the possibility that the important detail belongs not to the night itself, but to the days before or after. Someone may remember a conversation on campus, a plan mentioned in passing, a sighting along a route, a vehicle near the area, or a statement from someone whose significance was not clear at the time. The case's long life means that many peripheral memories may have aged into relevance. Yet relevance must still be tested. A memory that feels connected may not be connected. A person seen near a road may not be Maura. A remark repeated years later may have changed in the telling. The investigator receives each offering with gratitude and caution, because both are necessary. Gratitude keeps the door open, caution keeps the file honest. Together, they form the tone that should guide all patient detective work, especially in a case where the public has sometimes wanted answers faster than the evidence could responsibly provide. At times, the road in Haverhill has seemed almost too small to carry the weight placed on it. It is a road among other roads, with ordinary winter maintenance, local traffic, homes, trees, and the long rural distances that characterize that part of New Hampshire. But cases can make certain places larger in memory, not because the places change, but because people keep returning to them with questions. If you stand there in thought, you may notice how the mind wants to fill the roadside with movement. It wants to see Maura walking, or waiting, or entering a vehicle, or turning toward a house, because the mind dislikes a blank space. But the disciplined imagination stops short of declaring what it cannot know, and instead lets the road remain as it is, a place where something known ended and something unknown began. This restraint is difficult, but it is the heart of the investigation. To imagine possibilities can help search and analysis, but to confuse imagination with memory is dangerous. The road does not show us what happened next. It only asks us to keep looking from the last place where the record can still stand. The car, once removed from the road, became part of evidence rather than landscape. Its contents, damage, and history were studied, and its existence continued to anchor the case even after it was no longer physically at the scene. Objects from a case change meaning this way, moving from everyday use into the solemn custody of inquiry. Evidence custody is one of the quietest forms of promise. It says that the object will be preserved, labeled, protected, and kept available for whatever future question may need it. In old cases, that promise can last for decades, and the people who maintain it may never meet the family or see the final outcome, yet their care may matter enormously. The evidence in Maura's case has not publicly delivered a final answer, but preservation still matters. A future technique, a future comparison, or a future statement could make an old item newly useful. Many solved cold cases have turned on evidence that waited years before the world developed the right question or the right tool. Still, one must be careful not to overpromise technology. Not every case has biological evidence, not every item can yield new information, and not every mystery is solved by a laboratory. Patient investigation includes technology when it helps, but it also includes interviews, maps, searches, records, and the slow human work that no machine can replace. The Maura Murray investigation is not mainly a story of dazzling forensics. It is a story of timelines, terrain, witness accounts, family advocacy, law enforcement judgment, and the long effort to understand a disappearance that occurred in a narrow window under ordinary conditions. Its difficulty lies partly in that ordinariness, because there is no single unmistakable clue leading outward from the scene. A single unmistakable clue would have changed everything. A confirmed ride, a confirmed sighting, a message after the crash, a discovered item along a path, or a reliable confession could have given the case a direction. Instead, investigators have had to move through probabilities, and probabilities are useful but rarely comforting. Probabilities help decide where to search, whom to interview, and what theory deserves attention, but they do not tell a family where their daughter is. They can guide the work while leaving the heart unsatisfied. This is one of the central sorrows of patient detective work, that the mind may make progress while the family still waits at the same unanswered door. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more people may begin to speak of it as if it exists outside time. But Maura's case has not existed outside time for those who love her. Time has passed in birthdays, legal filings, searches, interviews, anniversaries, and ordinary mornings when the absence remains, and any retelling should let that passage be felt without turning it into drama. In some ways, the investigation has been a long conversation between time and memory. Time erodes, but it also reveals. Memory fades, but it can also settle into clearer patterns. People forget details, but sometimes they remember the one thing they never said, because they did not know where it belonged. The detective's task is to make a place for such memory. A tip line, an interview room, a family appeal, a public notice, and a renewed media story can all become places where memory is invited to speak. Whether it does is never guaranteed, and so the case continues, not as a constant public event, but as an open question maintained by those who refuse to let the file close without an answer. There is something deeply human in that refusal. It says that a person does not disappear from moral concern simply because evidence is difficult, and that the measure of care is not how quickly answers come, but whether the search remains honest. Honesty has a soft sound here. It is not bluntness, and it is not cynicism. It is the willingness to say that the case is unresolved, that several possibilities remain, that some information may be known only to investigators, and that public speculation should never be allowed to replace the slower authority of fact. As the night of the retelling grows deeper, the investigation becomes less a sequence of events and more a pattern of returning. Return to the road, return to the timeline, return to the family's words, return to the first accounts, return to the searches, return to the missing person's humanity, return and return again, because patient work is often made of returns. The act of returning does not mean nothing has changed. Each return carries what was learned before. A later reading of a witness statement includes knowledge of all the leads that failed to support it, all the theories that stretched beyond it, and all the years that have passed without contradiction or confirmation. Time does not solve the statement, but it changes the way it is held. In that sense, the file becomes more layered with every year. The first report remains the first report, but around it gather later interviews, legal documents, public accounts, search records, and the memory of how each detail has been understood by different people at different times. The investigator must see through the layers without tearing them apart. Some layers are helpful, others obscure. A public theory may attach itself to a fact so firmly that later readers confuse the two. A rumor may appear in enough places that it begins to look documented. A correction may exist but remain less visible than the mistake. These are modern problems in old cases, and they require patient sorting. Sorting is humble work. It may not produce a headline, but it restores the file to itself. It says, this is known, this is claimed, this is inferred, this is disputed, this is unsupported, and this is still worth asking about. In a case like Maura's, that kind of sorting can feel almost like clearing snow from a path, a little at a time. You clear the path not because you know where it ends, but because walking carefully matters. Somewhere beyond the last confirmed fact, there is a truth, even if it is not yet reachable. The work honors the truth by refusing to cover it with unnecessary noise. There is comfort, of a limited kind, in knowing that the case has not been abandoned. Official attention, family persistence, and public awareness have kept Maura's disappearance from becoming merely an old clipping. Her name is still searchable, still spoken, still attached to appeals for information, and still capable of drawing people back to the question of what happened after the Saturn came to rest. But comfort must not be overstated. Continued attention is not closure. An age-progressed image is not an answer. A search is not an answer. A documentary is not an answer. Each may serve the search, but the answer remains something else, something quieter and more final than public attention can provide. That finality, when it comes in cold cases, is often complicated. Families may receive truth without receiving peace, or receive a location without receiving a full explanation, or receive confirmation that only opens a different kind of grief. Still, most families say the not knowing is its own long suffering, and the search for an answer continues because uncertainty itself has weight. Maura's family has carried that weight for more than 2 decades now. The world has changed around the case in countless ways, but the central facts remain anchored in February of 2004. A young woman drove north, reached a road in New Hampshire, and vanished before help could bring her safely back into view. To investigate such a case is to live with humility as a daily tool. You cannot force a witness to remember, force the land to reveal, force the past to explain itself, or force the missing person's choices to become legible. You can only keep the work honest, preserve what can be preserved, ask what can be asked, and remain ready for the small piece that may someday change the shape of everything. This readiness is quiet, but it is not passive. It is the readiness of a file kept open, of evidence stored carefully, of a family continuing to speak, of investigators willing to listen to new information, and of a public asked to remember responsibly. It is the readiness that has solved other old cases after years, and while it promises nothing, it refuses to say that nothing can ever change. Perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand the investigation now. It is a long readiness. Not a chase, not a spectacle, not a story racing toward revelation, but a readiness maintained across seasons, through frustration, through public noise, through fading memories, and through the deep wish that one day a small confirmed fact will arrive and settle gently into the place where so much has been missing. Until then, the road remains in memory, and the file remains open. The questions are familiar, but familiarity has not made them less important. What brought her there? Where did she go? Who saw something and did not yet understand it? And what piece of the night has remained out of reach for all these years? The investigator does not need to answer aloud before the evidence does. They can close the folder for the evening, not because the case is finished, but because patient work accepts rest as part of endurance. The lamp can be switched off, the map can remain marked, and the name on the file can wait still held with care until the next careful reading begins. The next careful reading begins with the oldest pages, because the earliest pages are often the closest to the weather of the event, even when they are not complete. You notice the practical language first, the way official records describe times, locations, vehicles, and persons without knowing which words will still be examined 20 years later. There is something tender about those early notations, not because they are emotional, but because they were written before the case had become a burden carried by so many people. A report is meant to preserve what can be preserved, yet every report also reveals the limits of the moment in which it was made. The officer writes what is available, the witness says what they remember, the dispatcher records what is said over a line, and none of them can step outside time to see which detail will matter most. Later investigators must treat those first records with care, neither dismissing them for what they lack, nor asking them to provide more certainty than they were able to hold. In a long investigation, even plain words can become worn smooth from being handled too often. Vehicle, female, roadway, operator, unknown, and missing can start to feel like stones carried in a pocket, familiar by touch, but still heavy. The patient reader slows down around them, because ordinary procedural language may be the closest surviving structure around a very human absence. From there, the work widens again into the surrounding accounts. Each person who was near the scene held only a small portion of the evening, and each portion had to be fitted beside the others without forcing a perfect seam. A neighbor may know what was visible from a window, a driver may know what the road looked like in passing, and a responder may know what the vehicle looked like once official help arrived. Those pieces overlap, but they do not become a full picture. They are more like lamplight falling across different parts of the same room, showing a chair here, a doorway there, and leaving corners in shade. The investigator does not curse the shade, because shade is part of the room. Instead, they mark where it lies and ask whether any later detail can bring a little more light. One of the quiet skills in such work is separating what a witness saw from what a witness later understood. At the time, a car off the road was a car off the road, while later it became the place where Maura Murray was last known to be. This transformation can affect memory, not because witnesses are dishonest, but because the mind naturally revisits important moments and sometimes adds the weight of later knowledge to the original scene. So an investigator asks not only what was remembered, but when it was first remembered in that form. Was the detail in the earliest statement, or did it appear after media coverage? Was the witness certain from the beginning, or did certainty grow over time? These are gentle but important questions because memory is not a photograph in a drawer. It is a living thing, and living things change under pressure. For the listener sitting with the case, this may be one of the most useful lessons. Not every inconsistency means deception. Not every later detail means invention. People remember unevenly, especially when an event seemed ordinary at first, and good investigation respects that unevenness, while still protecting the file from being reshaped by it. The case also required attention to what was not seen. No one publicly confirmed seeing Maura safely reach another place that night, no one produced a verified account of her later life, and no discovery near the scene resolved the question. These absences have become part of the case's structure, though absences must always be handled with caution, because the world often fails to record things that nonetheless happened. The absence of a record is not the same as the absence of an event. Someone may pass unseen on a dark road, enter a vehicle unnoticed, cross a property without leaving a durable trace, or make a choice that no camera, phone, or witness captures. Investigators know this, and yet they also know that a long chain of absences begins to shape probabilities even when it does not create proof. This is the balancing act that runs beneath the entire investigation. Too much weight placed on absence can close off possibilities that remain real, while too little weight can keep every possibility alive forever, even those that grow weaker with time. The patient detective keeps adjusting that balance, not once, but over and over, as new information arrives or old information is understood in a clearer way. The terrain around Haverhill asks for the same kind of balance. It is possible to imagine someone leaving the road and becoming difficult to find, especially in winter darkness, where a short distance into trees can change the world completely. It is also possible to recognize that searches were made, that trained people looked, and that the lack of discovery after so many efforts complicates any explanation that depends solely on the nearby landscape. You do not have to solve that tension to understand its importance. You only have to sit with it honestly, as searchers and investigators have done. The woods might conceal, and the searchers might still have been careful. Both can be true at once, and many cold cases live in the narrow space where two true statements do not add up to an answer. Maps offer a kind of comfort because they make uncertainty look measurable. You can mark the crash site, trace possible walking routes, estimate distances, and note the homes, roads, and wooded areas nearby. For a while, the paper or screen feels obedient, as if the case might be solved by geometry alone. But a map does not show cold feet, racing thoughts, embarrassment, fear of consequences, trust in a stranger, distrust of a stranger, or the simple human urge to move away from a difficult moment. It does not show which porch light felt welcoming, which direction seemed less exposed, or whether a passing vehicle slowed at exactly the wrong or right time. Geography matters deeply, but it never tells the entire story. The investigator, therefore, uses the map as a tool, not a master. It can test whether a witness account is practical, whether a search area made sense, whether a reported sighting fits distance and time, or whether a route toward a possible destination remains plausible. It can narrow, question, and clarify, but it cannot replace the missing minutes after Maura was last seen. Those minutes remain small in length and enormous in consequence. It is almost difficult to think about them without leaning forward. But the calmer approach is to let them remain minutes, not turn them into a stage. A few ordinary minutes on a winter road may contain walking, waiting, deciding, accepting help, avoiding help, hiding briefly, or nothing that anyone has yet named correctly. Investigators return to those minutes because they had to. Every theory passed through them, and every theory was changed by them. If Maura left before police arrived, those minutes are the doorway. If someone else entered the scene, those minutes are the opportunity. If she remained nearby but unseen, those minutes are the beginning of a different kind of search. The difficulty is that time does not preserve itself for later inspection. It passes through people, devices, reports, and recollections, and each of those holds it imperfectly. A dispatcher's log may be precise in one way, a witness's sense of time precise in another, and the actual flow of the evening may sit somewhere between them, ordinary and unreachable. When investigators study the timeline, they are not only asking what happened first and second, they are asking how much confidence each marker deserves, how the markers relate, and whether a small shift in one place changes the meaning of another. In a case like this, a few minutes can decide whether one possibility is practical, improbable, or still quietly open. The route north before the crash invites a different kind of patience. Maura's travels that day were not fully random because travel always leaves some record of direction. But the purpose behind the direction remains unsettled. People have considered places she may have known, lodging she may have looked for, roads she might have intended to take, and the possibility that the journey itself mattered more than any single destination. A young person leaving campus in winter may be seeking rest, privacy, distance, a familiar landscape, or simply a pause from immediate responsibilities. None of those possibilities needs to be judged harshly. The investigator can ask why she left while still recognizing that many people, especially when overwhelmed, try to solve inner pressure by changing outer location. But changing location does not always solve what follows. A road trip begun for one private reason can be interrupted by weather, mechanical trouble, misjudgment, a wrong turn, an accident, or an encounter that changes everything. The beginning of the journey may explain only the beginning, and the investigator must not assume that it explains the end. This is why the case refuses to sit still. It has a pre-road mystery and a roadside mystery, and those two mysteries touch but do not completely merge. One asks what Maura intended, and the other asks what occurred after intention met accident, darkness, and the cold realities of Route 112. When an investigation has two such centers, too much focus on Maura's state of mind may draw attention away from what happened near the car, while too much focus on the roadside may neglect the choices that brought her there. The patient approach allows both inquiries to remain active, connected by care rather than by premature certainty. The family's search has often helped keep that larger view alive. Family members do not always think like investigators, and that can be important. They bring knowledge of personality, habit, history, and relationship, and they may notice when an explanation sounds tidy to outsiders, but wrong to those who knew the missing person closely. At the same time, families are asked to endure the investigative need to consider possibilities they may find painful or unlikely. This is a difficult burden because love has its own knowledge and its own limits. A compassionate investigation listens to family knowledge without surrendering the whole case to it, and it tests other possibilities without treating family belief as an obstacle. In Maura's case, the family's endurance has become one of the defining features of the investigation. It has kept official attention under watch, kept public awareness alive, and kept Maura herself from being swallowed by theory. A case can become famous, but family persistence helps keep it personal, and personal is closer to truth than famous will ever be. There is a quiet difference between wanting the case solved and wanting a story. The family wants Maura. Investigators want evidence that can support a real conclusion. The public, when it is at its best, wants both truth and dignity, though public curiosity can sometimes drift toward narrative satisfaction rather than care. A story can end wherever the storyteller chooses. An investigation cannot. It can only end where the evidence, the facts, and the human reality finally allow it to end. Until then, every responsible retelling has to resist the easy comfort of a final sentence that the case itself has not earned. In this way, the Maura Murray case teaches restraint not only to detectives, but to everyone who listens. It teaches that not knowing is not a gap to be filled with whatever feels most compelling. It is a space to be guarded, because the true answer, if it arrives, must be able to enter that space without finding it crowded by invention. The public record has grown large, but large is not the same as complete. Articles, interviews, message boards, podcasts, documentaries, legal filings, official pages, and family statements have all contributed to what people think they know. Yet somewhere beneath all that material is the original case, quieter than the conversation around it, still asking for the same things it asked in the beginning. Where did she go after the car? Who, if anyone, saw her? What piece of information has not been connected correctly? What remains in the file that only makes sense when placed beside something no one has yet brought forward? These questions are not new, but old questions can remain useful when they are asked with care. It is possible that the answer rests in a detail already known to investigators but not publicly understood. It is possible that the answer rests with a person who has never spoken. It is possible that the answer lies in terrain searched before, but not in the exact way needed, or in a route considered before, but not with the right supporting information. It is also possible that the answer will not come in the form people imagine. Cold cases often shift through quiet administrative acts. A record matched, a name recognized, a property examined, a memory clarified, or an item retested. The great emotional meaning of the answer does not require a dramatic arrival. Sometimes truth enters softly, carrying a folder under its arm. That softness is important here. The case has already carried enough strain. It does not need thunder. It needs accuracy, steadiness, and the continued willingness of people with knowledge to speak to those who can place that knowledge where it belongs. For investigators, receiving late information means doing old work in a new present. They must evaluate whether the person reporting it could have known the detail, whether the account is consistent with earlier evidence, whether it has been influenced by public material, and whether it leads to something independently checkable. This process may feel slow to those waiting outside, but speed without verification can damage a case that has already waited many years. The waiting outside is its own experience. Families wait for calls, for updates, for searches, for meetings, for files, for someone to say that a lead was meaningful or that it was not. The public waits in a less intimate way, returning when attention rises, but the family's waiting has no off-season because absence does not follow media cycles. That difference should always be remembered. A listener can drift to sleep after hearing the case, and that is all right, because rest is human and needed. But the people closest to Maura have lived with the question awake, in ways no gentle retelling can fully measure. The purpose of calm narration is not to make the case smaller, it is to make the listening more respectful. Calm allows the details to be approached without appetite, and it allows the missing person to remain central without being consumed by the machinery of mystery. In the quiet, a fact can be just a fact, and a family's pain can be acknowledged without being used. If you return again to the university, you may see the beginning of the known trail in softer light. A student leaves a campus where countless students leave and return every day. She takes roads that countless drivers take without consequence. She reaches a place where an accident or roadside incident brings attention, and then something happens that has kept investigators returning for more than 2 decades. The ordinary beginning is part of why the case lingers. It suggests that life can change not with a single dramatic sign, but through a chain of small events that only later appear connected. A message here, a decision there, a turn in the road, a stopped car, a neighbor's call, and then the world tilting quietly out of its expected shape. Investigators are trained to turn tilted worlds back into sequences. They gather, compare, test, and document. But some worlds do not write themselves easily, and the Maura Murray case has remained tilted because the central sequence breaks just where everyone most needs it to continue. The break is not very wide on the clock, but it is immense in meaning. Between the last sighting near the car and the recognition that she was missing, there is a space into which 20 years of searching have looked. That space has held theories, grief, criticism, dedication, and hope, but it has not yet given back the simple continuation everyone seeks. A simple continuation would be almost unbearable in its relief. She walked here. She met this person. She reached this place. This happened next. The mind wants that chain because chains are how we understand movement, and a missing person case without a chain leaves the mind holding separate links. So the investigation keeps searching for the missing link, though perhaps it is more than one. It may be a witness, a route, a destination, a phone call, an object, a confession, a landscape detail, or a record that has not yet been read in the right way. Patient work accepts that it may not know in advance what form the needed piece will take. This is part of the humility of cold case investigation. You cannot demand that the truth arrive in the form most convenient for your theory. You prepare to recognize it in whatever form it can still take, even if it arrives faintly, late, and through a path no one expected. Some investigators speak of cold cases as conversations with the past. The past speaks through reports, objects, witnesses, maps, photographs, and absences, but it speaks unevenly. The detective listens, asks again, waits, and sometimes hears only the same old silence settling back over the room. Even then, the conversation is not meaningless. It keeps the past from becoming sealed. It keeps Maura's disappearance in the realm of inquiry rather than resignation. It keeps open the possibility that someone somewhere may recognize that what they know is not too small after all. A small thing can be a direction, a small thing can be a time, a small thing can be a correction to an assumption that has quietly shaped the case for years. In patient detective work, small things are treated with tenderness because they may be fragile, but they are also tested carefully because tenderness alone is not proof. The investigation, at its calmest and most disciplined, is an act of holding both tenderness and proof in the same hands. Tenderness remembers Maura as loved. Proof remembers that answers must be earned. Without tenderness, the case becomes mechanical. Without proof, it becomes a story drifting away from the person it claims to honor. As night settles again over the imagined desk, the file does not look solved, but it does look cared for. There are notes, maps, clipped articles, official records, search references, and perhaps photographs that bring Maura's face back into the room whenever the facts begin to feel too abstract. The investigator looks at the photograph not for clues, but for orientation, a reminder of whose absence gives the work its meaning. Then the road returns in thought, as it always does. The shoulder, the snow, the curve, the nearby homes, the winter dark, and the stopped Saturn appear again, not as a scene to be dramatized, but as a place to be understood. Every responsible path through the case passes there quietly, pauses, and asks what the night still knows. The night, of course, does not answer. It never has. But people do, sometimes after years, and records do, sometimes when reviewed with new care, and landscapes do, sometimes when searched under better guidance. The investigation continues because the silence of the night is not the only silence in the case. There may be human silence too, the silence of uncertainty, fear, shame, forgetfulness, or simple failure to recognize importance. Human silence can change. A person who once thought they had nothing useful may come to understand that usefulness belongs not to the size of the detail, but to how it fits with the rest of the file. This is why the appeal remains gentle but persistent. If something was seen, said, heard, found, or remembered, it can still matter. It does not have to solve the case alone. It only has to be true enough to be placed beside other true things, where patient investigators can see whether it begins to align. The hope for alignment is quieter than the hope for revelation, and perhaps more realistic. A long case may not open with one key turning in one lock. It may open through a series of small alignments, each one narrowing the dark by a little, until the unknown is no longer wide enough to hide the answer. For now, the unknown remains wide. It stretches from Amherst to Haverhill, from the last ordinary campus hours to the winter road, from the first search to the most recent appeal, and from family memory to public awareness. Yet within that wide unknown, there are still fixed points, and fixed points matter. Maura was here, the car was there, people looked. Her family kept asking. Investigators kept records. Years passed, and the case remained open. These statements do not solve the mystery, but they keep it honest, and honesty is the ground on which any future answer must stand. So the detective's work and the listener's quiet attention return to that ground. Not to rush, not to accuse, not to force a pattern where none has been proven, but to remain faithful to the known while making space for what may still become known. This is what it means to investigate a case like Maura Murray's. Not once, not briefly, but over years, with patience as both method and mercy.